I'm so happy to be here. This is my first time giving this workshop related to ASL grammar. I have been teaching ASL and grammar for 3 or 4 years now, and it's really interesting. I wanted to share, wait just a moment. Okay, so this list is what we will be covering today in this workshop. So this is what you see on the slide. And so now looking at the first one, unboxing journey. So how do we start unboxing? So now as an ASL instructor for the last 4 years, that's when I started to really understand, and in teaching, I saw some things that I wanted to clarify. It made me want to assess further. And that's when I really started getting heavily involved in trying to teach this in a clear way. So interestingly, before I was an ASL teacher, I, yes, noted ASL as a language, but wasn't really immersed in it. I was more of an artist and in entertainment. And so I wanted to stay in school, however, so I decided to become a teacher so I could stay in school. So my focus turned into this ASL and ASL grammar. So there are so many terms that I will describe, and these are terms that I have created and put into this presentation because my students will be able to understand it in those terms better and more clear. For example, thus far in teaching ASL grammar, we use the word classifier, CL, or depicting verb. And so we use those terms and explain them, and I use those terms and explain to students, but instead I'd rather show 3D. You need to be able to stretch and expand into a 3D space. So students start to understand and better visualize what they need to do based on a different term that I'm using. So now we will start with grammar. So here, talking about focal point, there's another word called topicalization. Another word, we look at subject, verb, object, SVO. Some people will also say OSV. It's a different order. And so this is how grammar is taught and emphasized. But in looking at this way in daily conversation and my signing, we may not really be following that grammar. So I've been looking at that further. And so this ASL language, it's flexible, just like spoken language is so flexible. So I decided to use focal point as a term. So in the sentence, the beginning of the sentence, that's your focal point. So this is your topic that you're introducing. This is what you're putting a spotlight on. And so I call this the focal point. So this is how I'm explaining how you want to create a sentence. So use this approach. This would be good for example, so here on this slide, you see the focal point is good for when you want to put emphasis on something important. And so previously in grammar, I've seen this taught where you have 4 different categories: time, location, object, and subject. I want to expand a little bit on object and subject and what the difference is between the two. So your subject is, so it's your main point of, it's either person or thing, and it's reacting to an object. So the subject reacts to an object. So typically in grammar, we're taught to follow time, location, object, and subject, because it's easy to explain. First, you have your time for when, and then your 3D space and your setting, what started first. But in actual ASL use, it really doesn't matter. The focal point is what's important. So I want to caution you that there are some interpreters who want to practice their signs, and they're instructed by ASL teachers who are emphasizing this grammar. And what can happen is an overuse of certain grammar features, and it doesn't appear natural. Yes, it's okay to use focal point, but you don't need to apply it to every sentence. You only want to use it when you are emphasizing. Use that as a guide for emphasis, to spotlight. And so I'll give some examples. So you see the first sentence. The sentence states, they don't like the law. Now the focal point is law. So then I'll move that to the beginning of the sentence. Law, they don't like. Law becomes the focal point. The next sentence states, Spider-Man swings around the skyscrapers. The focal point, to make the sentence clear, can be those skyscrapers. Spider-Man swings through and around them. So the reason you use this approach, it helps to set up your 3D space and then show what's going on around this space. The next sentence includes time, location, subject, and object. It states, I will adopt a dog from the shelter soon. So this could be, if you want to focus on the time, soon I'll adopt a dog from the shelter. You can switch it around to another focal point if you want to focus on the shelter. You start, shelter, I will adopt a dog soon. And you can move the sentence around again. Dog, I will adopt from the shelter soon. So that shows a variation of what you're emphasizing as your focal point. So as you're using and learning how to use, it's important to determine your focal point. If you think time is important, then start with time. If you feel that the object is most important, focus on that. If you feel the location is important, it's flexible. So the next sentence states, yesterday, President commanded security guards to sweep. So focusing on the security guards, the guards, yesterday, the president ordered them to go sweep. So you can move around the sentence based on the focal point. Yesterday could be put at the end. If time is not so important, you can say President commanded security guards to sweep yesterday. So it's flexible.
Okay. So another example, I think I want to hold on and make sure that everybody is okay and there's no questions. We're all set? Okay. If you do have a question that comes up, I'll give you some time after these last three examples. So this first sentence is that God watches the world from above every day. So you can move that around and say the world, God is watching every day from above every day. So you can switch those things around. It's very flexible. So the next sentence, or the last sentence, the vehicle drove roughly on the mountains a while ago. So you can show the vehicle driving roughly on the mountains and move things around. So a while ago, on the mountains, the car was driving roughly. So I think I've talked through all of the important focal points there. So before I get going on to the next point of grammar, I just want to see if there's any discussion that people want to focus on related to this point. All set? Okay. So how do you know when to focus on the focal point? I think it's more kind of a natural happening when so from English, I can make the focal point in ASL. In English, we can move the sentence around as well in the same way. So for example, like you've said, God watches over the world from above every day. In English, you can move that around too. You can say every day, God watches the world from above. It's the same meaning. So you can even say from above, God watches over the world every day. So in English, you can do that. And ASL, you can do something similar. So for, casual conversation, I think it's kind of the same thing. Maybe ASL has a little bit more emphasis on focal point, but again, in English, you can do the same thing. So it's the ability to teach children how to know what the focal point is. And I think it's exposure and getting them to practice. But I think for interpreters, how do we know if we're supposed to focus on something specifically? Because I think it's the interpreter understands that there's a concept that has to be emphasize first and then explain that afterwards. I think that's the point that we're focusing on. Does that answer your question, I hope? So just to expand on that a little bit, I teach 4 levels, ASL 1, 2, 3, and 4. And my first level is really focused on that word translation. So that's just kind of the basics, core focus points. ASL 2 is more focused on sentence structure, how to set up a sentence and how to move things around in ASL. Level 3 focuses more on kind of the 3D setup with some non-manual markers and how that gives meaning. 4, I haven't actually started to teach yet, but that's going to be a lot more inclusive of explanation of how data works and how statistics work within language. So the first one, I do see a lot of the same word for word translation. This workshop, I'm not going to go much into the ASL 1, but that actually does give me some ideas for the future. So at the end of the workshop, maybe I can show you what it looks like, some of those word translations into ASL. Okay, so moving on to the next thing. So now we'll talk about 3D verbs. So this idea of 3D verbs, there's another label as directive verbs or agreement verbs, which is really just using space or 3D space so you can see where the reaction is going. Is it going out? Am I reacting, or is somebody reacting to me? Am I reacting to myself? So that's the idea of a 3D verb. So again, I use that word 3D to show because ASL is a 3D language. So even simple things, verbs move in ASL. And so we're watching how that reaction moves in which direction. So many people assume that it applies only when the subject is reacting to something, some object. But that's actually not true. It could be just an individual is reacting. Like thinking. So thinking or thinking. So you're showing a 3D action, thinking or thinking as it's all coming out. So it's just me as an individual, and I'm still going through this 3D verb motion. So you can see where the different reactions are.
So this is really interesting. I'll show you an example. As I have assessed 3D verbs, I'm seeing high frequent 3D verbs relate to two things: looking, as people are looking at me, looking at them, looking at others, and then going and coming. And then medium frequent 3D verbs: send, ask, email, showing the direction, texting, driving, taking, giving, tell, picture, like taking pictures or video. So that would be medium frequent. Low frequent 3D verbs, but still 3D verbs: push and pull, connect, love. I'm showing examples of direction: hate, fight, contact, observe. And then we have those 3D verbs that are limited, like. It's difficult. You can say like, "Ooh, I like, I really like, I want," or, I want all of those things. It's hard for you to sign want as if something wants from you, and to know that's also limited, and those feelings is also limited. But basically all verbs are able to be 3D and have 3D influence. Now I will show some examples of sentences comparing those non-3D with those 3D verbs. So this is no 3D. I email them. Now when I incorporate 3D, I email them. Do you see my body shift to the direction of the space where I was emailing? I'm incorporating 3D, and it showed that sentence in a clear way. Without 3D, they film them. Now with 3D, I'm showing the direction of them filming in the direction of where they're filming. So it makes it much more clear. Oh, I think I made a mistake on that sentence. It should say, me and they connect. Me and they connect. So I'm 3D connecting myself with where the other person is. What's interesting is oftentimes 3D verbs can cut the pronoun out. When I'm reacting to a pronoun, I actually don't have to state the pronoun. Not always, but I can. Such as, I love, 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 meaning I love everyone. So I incorporated everyone into the sign for love in the direction that I moved the love you sign. So I'm using my space around me. For example, with email, I email, and I'm moving the direction of email to the space around me, which is meaning that I am emailing all. And so I can do direction coming towards me. I can say they email. Well, I don't know if I could say that. You don't typically do they, all of them emailing me, but you can say, you can show space of people around you all emailing and coming my direction. So but it's not only one way. You can have email come from one person to another person and then to me, or I email one person and then they email the person next to them. Another sentence. I'll take you tomorrow. I take tomorrow. I don't have to say you, but I take, and I'm showing take. That action shows take you. So oftentimes you don't actually indicate the pronoun. Send me a message, but I didn't say me. Send me is in one sign. Send me a message. So now test and thinking about how you will use these 3D verbs. They take a lot of pictures of us looking at each other. So basically, they are taking pictures. So you see the direction of them taking pictures. I'm showing the taking pictures from them towards us, and we are looking at each other. So the looking is showing is actually directionally focused on each other. You let me know, or you watch them as they let me know. It's difficult to understand, but when you incorporate 3D, it's very clear. You watch them, and then they'll let me know. So you see it very clearly. Without the 3D space, you watch them, they let me know, and I just, I don't get it. It's very difficult, and it's not clear without showing in 3D. Before I move to the last line, I see that there are questions and want to open up for questions related to 3D verbs. And you can use the raise hand feature. Okay. So, well, before I go on to the next grammar piece related to facial expressions, I express hard. So how would you depict this? Oh, hello. Did you have a question? Hold on to that. I express. So see how I'm expressing. I'm not saying hard. I didn't have to say the vocabulary word hard, but I showed it in the way that I showed express. This ties into my next topic, but before that, I want to make sure there's no questions. So now with mouth movement adverbs, I call it mouth movement adverbs. And the reason why I have labeled this, there are other terms, mouth morphemes, which is mouth meanings, or non-manual markers, meaning that there's no hands involved. It's your body language and your facial expressions, which we abbreviate NMS. So I want to focus here, though, on adverbs, because this is when you don't have to sign that word that's depicted in your facial expressions or your body language, whether it's an adverb or an adjective. So it's on your face. And that way you use fewer signs, and the language is it's a neat way to communicate. And I'll explain further. It's actually better if I show you the pictures and not word-based. When I teach ASL, the fast way is using the word is this face, okay? Like, yeah, it's just your everyday, easy, casual. Next, this E face, so as you're looking at my face, you see it's the E face. It means it's intense, it's extreme, it's hard. This ooh face is smooth. You can use it for fast. You can use that for small, pretty, light. This tongue out face is messy, careless, awkward, so it's your tongue out face. And then your sta, it means long, just really long. This one, the blow raspberry, means pro, expert. Open smile, happy, inspiring. Squeeze lips, pursed lips. And so those facial expressions that I just showed apply to any of those verbs. Well, I guess I wouldn't say many. I mean any, but I would say many. For example, I travel. Now I can use these facial expressions easy. So I could travel, oh, it's just easy travel. If it's hard travel, then I use this facial expression. If it's the ooh travel, then it's smooth. Or it's, this kind of travel, tongue out travel, it's sloppy or long. And here's, I'm a pro at traveling. And so, or happy traveling. So it's all of this is incorporated in just one sign of travel. So I'm using the same exact sign, travel, but my facial expressions show different meaning. So if you're interpreting or you're teaching, you have different meaning dependent on what your mouth is doing. So let me give you a different example with taking pictures. I will change my mouth morphemes while signing the same sign. Pictures. Just note my sign, my mouth morpheme. Okay, wow. Didn't you see? There's so many different meanings. Now, as a test, for opening that box, that ASL grammar box, use these, you're opening the box, okay? It's easy, hard, fast. Look at my mouth morphemes. Awkward, long with sta. Okay, long is typically sta. You usually do it double. It's not just once, but the other ones you typically can use just one time. Next, we have the pro mouth morpheme, happy, serious. Yeah. Okay. Like I love you. You can do the same thing with I love you in those mouth morphemes. Any questions? Okay, those are focused on those verbs, the verb part. Next, we'll talk about the adjective with what facial expressions affect an adjective. These facial expressions affect a verb. Okay, so remember there was someone who had a comment saying is facial expressions going to be incorporated, and that is that does affect sign language, and can create lots of differences. So any questions? Y'all are following me so far? Any questions? Okay, great. So I will move on to the adjectives. Oh, I see. Okay, so with the adjectives, I did go down to two things. So little to extreme. Notice my mouth morphemes. And with adjective, good. If I say good with this mouth morpheme, it's a little good. It's a little good. If it's really good, that's the mouth morpheme that I use. The rich is like a little rich, but E mouth morpheme is really rich. And so you can say cheap or super cheap, pretty, or extremely pretty. So you can see that on my face, the difference in meaning. And you see the difference between for verbs, there was a huge list. For adjectives, it's just two. They're very basic. So here, I see Jax has a hand up, so go ahead. Jax says, yes, sorry, thank you. I put in this list, you have test there. I see that on the PowerPoint. What does that mean? I don't understand what that's for. Yes, it's just for you to test yourselves. Oh, okay, thank you. I realized that I went ahead with the example, but it was intended to be a test. Thank you for clarifying. Yes, the test was really for you all to have a little bit of time to practice, but you can see, like the dinner was really expensive, or the dinner was a little expensive, or the little, the pretty house, as a little house or as a really pretty house. You can see my facial expressions. Now, as a test, think about what facial expressions you're using for the news reporter saw a cute dog, describing this cute dog with different expressions. So this will be a test.
So you can see the difference. So the reporter saw a really cute little dog, or the reporter saw, oh, such an adorable, cute little dog. All right, yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, I think there's two different teaching philosophies. One is the sort of clean, well, let's see, it's sort of one that's more restrictive and one that's more limited. So as a teacher, I try to give guidance with that mouth movement, but really, can they sign vary? Does that mean they're wrong? No, I think you have to be flexible. It's just that they should know that it's something that you can put on your face. And if you give them the examples of that, that will help. And as a teacher, I really try to give a lot of examples. So when we apply homework, and I suggest, put it on your mouth. But if you're chatting every day, if, somebody says, oh, that's a really good, and, that's fine if that's your preference and how you want to sign that. But as a teacher, I try to really give them some ideas about switching over to the facial expression. So if they learn that, and then it's time to actually go in there, we don't want people to be confused and think, well, they can't do that. And that's not the case. It's just that ASL is so great because you can put so much on your face. And so one of the approaches is restrictive and one of them is inclusive. And restrictives tends to think that a lot of things are wrong, and we don't want that to be the case. I try to steer a little bit more to the inclusive approach. Yeah, I really try to emphasize to students that English, one other guide, I see that adjective, does that go beforehand or does it go after the noun? And some people teach that it has to go after the noun, but I don't think that's true. I think you could do either way. So, it's a nice person that wants to see you, or you can move that around and say, this person's really nice and they want to see you. So it could be either way. So just something to keep in mind. It's really something that you can switch up, but whatever you want to emphasize. All right, so before I move on to the next grammar part, I want to see if there's any other questions. I think you can, if you're noticing, you feel like you're overusing or people are reacting, you can say, these things have meanings, and explain adverbs. That's a good way to explain, like cute or very cute, I have different meanings, and people will be able to understand a little bit better what you mean. Like, this is an adverb, so I'm defining my verb. And so people who use sign, if you see natural signers, they're doing that too, and there's meaning behind that. So there was a thing that went out on the news. Somebody was really going after one interpreter who was signing like this, and they're like, no, you don't do this, because, and people were kind of mocking the interpreter for using the tongue. But no, that was actually something that was important. But the interpreter didn't sign, it doesn't matter. They were just doing the tongue wag. And that was actually much more clear because it was an adverb to describe the driving. So it was much more clear. So, and then when you're done with the hand raise, hit the reaction again to do the lower hand. Because if it's on there, I will still think you're there, but if you do the lower hand, it will take your hand raise off. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next part. Okay, so now moving on to 3D scene. So the reason that I call it 3D scene is because it's like if you think about a dollhouse, as I'm describing the dollhouse, a person comes up and looks at it, or maybe a camera frame is looking at the dollhouse. And it's kind of nice because you can translate different sizes. So I can shrink it all down. Like a car is huge, but then I can shrink it down to just a hand shape. And so you can bring something that's very big into a smaller space, like a dollhouse view. So I was trying to think of some other word other than scene, and I couldn't come up with anything. This is the best thing I can think of for right now. So if you're talking about a building, it's huge, but if you're putting it in a 3D scene, it's like this. A person becomes something like this. A car is this or something like this. So the space, maybe you have a field or some kind of other space, an area, just in general, you can talk about it like this. If it's empty, nothing's there, you can use this middle finger sign. So this explains a little bit more why it's so much easier to see everything in a smaller scene space as opposed to large in actual life. So 3D really has so many different parts to it. So the scene is just the basics. A building, a person, a space, something that's empty, a car. But 3D really actually relates to architecture, transportation, plurals, elements, landscapes, appearance, technology, objects. So there's all kinds of different things that can be included. So I've just included some of the basics. So I'm going to do some comparisons, kind of three different parts of it. So if you have a non-3D and then a 3D, and just knowing what the verb is, and then true 3D scene, which means you're incorporating hand shape, a 3D hand shape, as well into your sentence. So if this is in non-3D, I saw a person walking. 3D as a verb, I saw a person walking. And now if you put the scene in, I saw a person walking. And so this person, you're focusing on the person. So the 3D scene is something that you can see a little bit, the perspective is a little bit clearer. Next sentence. I saw a person walking through a field of flowers. Third sentence. So without 3D, you would say the car goes around the building. So that's, sorry, that was 3D. It's because I'm using the hand shape. The car goes around the building, but you don't know what I'm talking about. But with 3D scene, you can see the car and the building shape, and it's much more clear to see, oh, how everything relates. So you can see, you don't have to put the verb in there specifically, you just see how it's all included. Everything's pretty obvious. And also another thing to discuss, do you have to explain the 3D after you have the noun? For example, a person is walking like this. This is the 3D. Do you have to do that after, or can you start with the person? And I think in some situations, it can be awkward to do the 3D before the noun. I think it's better to do after to be able to describe. But in some situations, you can put it before. So for example, long hair, this woman, I already described the long hair, so you're aware. And so you can say a woman with long hair. It could go either way. But generally, kind of a rough rule is that if you're using a 3D depictor, it's after the noun to make it clearer.
So now this is reference structure, so it's where I'm pointing, right? So in looking at where I'm pointing, you think, oh, it's just so simple. Like, yeah, of course, you're pointing to stuff, but it's simple, but it's so important that it's clear. So a word translated could be like the, at, to. It could be as a pronoun like they or them. It can show relationship. Alb or Alib, can you lower your hand from before? Okay. Now, the reason why I use the word reference structure is when I was using toward, and I realized it's not limited to the action itself. It's more general. You know, it could be an action, it could be a thing, an object. So then I called it referent. I learned that term and that idea from a curriculum called True Way ASL. It's an online curriculum in teaching ASL, and they mention referent for at and the, but I want to incorporate at and to and a. As far as when and how often to use reference structure, I would say use it to the max. And it's very clear. It shows clear communication. And let me just move on before I explain this next part. Okay, so for example, I go to the store or to the store. I could say I go and then point to the store, and that will show that it's the store. When I point to it, it indicates the store. Dance at beach. Dance pointing at the beach. Okay, so to be honest, I often do see a lot of deaf people include signing to and at because it's just easy to. Or you can say meet at and then point to the beach. So you can say at and still point to the beach, but you can also just point. It's good enough. Next, we have the clouds, pointing to the clouds, dark, and then showing really dark with the mouth morpheme. So you're pointing, but you're pointing among the clouds. So it's not just pointing at one cloud. You can point at one. You can say one of the. So you have your hand, and then you're looking at pointing at one of the five. One of those websites will improve. Next, you have at noon, we rise. So if it's related to time, you don't have to point. You can just say noon, we rise. And I don't intend to say that reference apply to all to and at terms, but it's the concept in general. The forest, pointing at the forest, is ancient. So I'm referring to the forest. Now here's a test. You all can practice here. Walk to the airport. Translating walk, pointing, airport. Now I just thought of something. So to and through, you can say walk, and then you can point but show travel through pointing. You don't have to point directly to the airport. You can use your mouth morpheme and pointing and show its movement. You can do any of three. So you show your three and you point to your three. The person is watching me. I think that the referent is good, but it is very simple. So are there any specific questions to this on how you use referent? I do teach this at the beginner ASL level. This is, your basic word translation. Okay. Now, I did add a note about of. You can spell of as well. Children of deaf parents. If you take out the of, I mean, let's see, parents and parents who are deaf and their children, you can, but it's easier sometimes just to say children of deaf adults. And I myself, well, hold on a second, hold on. Okay, I wanted to give you a little bit of background information. When I started teaching American Sign Language, I tried to assess if all English words like unless, if, or, but, and those types of words, I tried to create a sign for them and not try to fingerspell them. So I tried to sign, like, instead of unless, spelling unless, I would sign the word if, or I could just use one of the two, but I could say like understand or wait a minute. So I rather try to assess that on my own before I, preach or teach. So I assessed after using those terms that sometimes it's not appropriate to use those created signs because as a sign language user, it's easier just to spell sometimes a word, not for all signs, but for some specific signs like unless. It's quick to sign unless, but it's quick to spell unless. So it's not always about signing, using a sign. Sometimes people like to fingerspell for convenience. So sometimes I do like to use a sign, but some signs I don't care. I can just fingerspell them. So you can use one or the other. So in thinking of rain, R-A-I-N, I don't have to spell rain. I can sign rain. So I typically will sign rain. Whereas if the word function is like to, I can spell T-O, but sometimes I want to indicate with reference. So I can make that choice and we'll switch interpreters.
Okay, any questions about that before I move on to the next grammar point? Okay, so we'll move on. So this is role reaction, however you want to assign that. So people assume that it means that you must be looking to see, but that's not the case. So it's about really reaction, the reaction of the person. It can apply to three things: thoughts, something that you say, or action. So the first one, thoughts, is something like, I was writing and I was thinking. It doesn't mean that I was looking at the piece of paper that I was writing on. It was just that I was kind of a moment in action that I was kind of thinking about what I was doing. So this sign is a really strong 3D verb-based sign, and it's showing where you're looking. So, for example, they made a vow to each other. And so they're looking at each other and they're reacting to each other. So again, like this is their eyes looking at each other. The second one, watch the sunset and think. So again, you have the reaction included, but the interpreter wouldn't say something like looking at, but it's the moment that you're capturing. They say whatever, line, L-I-N-E. So they say, you don't have to say any kind of a reaction. It's just that they're saying this. So basically, when do you need to say it or when do you need to sign it? So I think if you want to incorporate an action in the moment, you can do that. Or if you just want to do something, you can spell it out. You don't have to put the reaction in. So, but it should agree to the action in the moment. So dialogue back and forth, you don't have to say they said, this person said, this person said. That's not necessary. It's in the sign. So, and again, they don't even have to be looking. It's just the signing back and forth. So I think as an interpreter, how would you interpret that? Truthfully, I'm not sure. I'm so deaf that I don't do that. So I let interpreters do that. So here's some examples. The dog wants food. So again, the dog wants food and maybe the dog is staring at the food. They laugh at me and they're kind of watching. I do a scenic run. So as I'm running, I'm looking around to see the scenery. So here's some tests. Thinking while driving. So you would translate that to driving, thinking. The second one, a person says, stop. So you can look and say, the person looks and says, stop it. Third one is that two people are speaking to other people. They say, please, and the other people say, okay. So how do I look at this? And I remember maybe 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, I was on stage for a play and there was music, but it was not necessarily, there was no sound, of course, that the person could hear. So we're singing the lyrics, and then there was a point where there were no lyrics. And so there was just kind of an ongoing humming of the line. And so it's important to talk about the pause in the lyrics and how would I sign that? Maybe something like this. There's no signing. And so I was trying to figure out what to do. And I thought, well, why don't I just do kind of a look and then do the lyrics and then a look to indicate the feeling. And I thought, oh, that is really a good thing to do in the pause between the lyrics. And that's where I kind of came up with the idea that really stayed with me until I started teaching. And I saw, I don't say they say this and they say that, but I remember back to that time and I was thinking about like, oh yeah, just how you make that connection with what the person is reacting to and how they're responding. So generally that's how I came up with this role reaction. Yeah, that's a really good point, is perspective. And it's not limited just to one direction. You can look at lots of different perspectives. You can observe and then you can be observed. Okay, so now equal structure. So what this means is that a noun is a noun. So for example, the sun is a star. So they're equal. So the sun is equal to a star. So in ASL, how would you sign that equality? So sometimes people say is, but what if you get rid of the is? Then what would that look like? So the sun star. So the sun itself is a star. The sun is a star. So there's a lot of different ways. And I was thinking about that. Remember where I talked before about like unless or if or but, not needing to sign those. Sometimes I do, but for this kind of equal structure, I do like that. So plus I grew up signing. So I say, oh yeah, equal structure is pretty clear to me, but a lot of teachers will say is or don't say that word is. And that's fine. But if you say sun star, that's not very clear. So if you remove too much, sometimes it becomes, it's not specific enough. It becomes kind of a weak sentence. And so you want to show the language strongly and the equality of those nouns. So remember I was talking about, trying to translate different English words, things that I think are too English. And so I came up with this idea of equal structure. So a noun is related to an adjective. So the woman's good, that's a little bit easier. But if a noun is related to a noun, you're kind of stuck. You do have to say something in between to let people know that it's an equal. So this kind of solves that problem. So what's the difference? This is or itself. So which just means kind of basically you can point to things and these are the same. So here is itself. That's a little bit more emphasis on that thing. If you show it like this, there's no 3D space. You're just speaking in general. You're not referring to anything specific. So let me expand on that a little bit more in the next slide. So for example, itself, there's no space relation. So like love, happiness, death, color, there's no space reference to that. It's that thing in and of itself. So love is beautiful. Love itself is beautiful. So, and that would equate to the English sentence, love is beautiful. So if you have a noun to a noun, person is my mother. Or if you want to emphasize that person herself is my mother. So if you just say person mother and you get rid of the is indicator, then you're just kind of like, what are you talking about? It's not a complete sentence. So if you put the equal structure additive in there, then it becomes a complete sentence. So USCD, University of California, San Diego, that's the acronym USCD, they have a linguistics research program. And I uploaded some information about equal structure on social media, and they got in touch with me and they said, we're actually doing research related to that right now, to equal structure. They didn't use that term, but they're researching the idea about the idea of itself. And so they wanted to test out with a native signer, which would you, I don't know exactly about what the research was, but I know just kind of surface information about it. So would you prefer to sign this or itself or point to? And so the person can click and pick which preference they had. And so there was no facial expression to go with it. So for example, if I said dog, point, mine. So dog itself, mine. So which one would you choose? And I thought, oh, okay. So they just want to focus on some of the different equality structures. So I also included itself without a reference. So I've been looking at their research results. I'm looking forward to see what they come up with. So kind of some new information that's coming out. So here's some examples, some of the tests that I want you to go through and interpret. So the water is the ocean. So if you want to emphasize the water here itself is the ocean. So the water, and you would point, is the ocean. the water is the ocean if you're not referring to it. So it can be any of those things. House, the house is expensive. Houses are expensive. So houses are expensive, or houses are expensive. So you could say the house itself is expensive.
I wanted to clarify the difference between pointing and the representation of what you're putting in space. You can point, while what you're putting in space is just in one spot. So I wanted to emphasize that. Like self is not repeated in space. It's just self. The sky is blue. This is a test. Sky, pointing to the sky. And so that becomes the structure when you're pointing to the sky. Equal structure. You can point to the sky and say blue, or neutral. You can say sky itself blue. Now is, so for summer is here. As I was looking at this, you can say summer itself is here, but is can mean now. So summer is now here. So summer now here. So I'm trying to tell you that equal structure is limited to those three, is not limited to those three things, but you can say it as your way of just, it's just your way of using equal structure. One of the games is good. So that's the equal structure. The movie is good, or the movie itself good. So I'm emphasizing this. Movie itself good. Are there any questions about this? Equal structure. Oftentimes I see deaf people sign fingerspell IS for is. As I teach ASL, I try to reduce the English influence on the language and train to reduce is. However, it's difficult for me to eliminate is. So I thought equal structure is a way to do that. Now UCSD is also researching this, so which is great. This is something, these are some notes that I just shared. To me, recognizing equal structure is new. It's not something that has been discussed in the past. And now we're looking at question structure. It's interesting in discussion about your hand-based questions versus your facial expression WH questions. In having this discussion, there are two directions. So you have your everyday questions and casual questions, and then you have your formal questions that may be like on stage and in an interview. Now, I'm going to skip to actually the next slide. So you see, really, there are 4 different ways to ask yes or no questions. So we're focusing here on the yes or no questions. So first you have, do they see you? The do question. Then we have the question, they see you. Third way, they see you question. So then you're indicating question at the end. The second one was indicating question at the beginning. And then they see you, and you're indicating a question with your eyebrows raised or lowered. So those are the 4 different question structures. Many are not taught. Most ASL teachers are teaching they see you with your eyebrows as a question. And yes, we do use our eyebrows as a question, but not always. And sometimes it's unclear if it is a question. So if we add the question mark sign, it becomes clear that you're asking a question, or we're adding the question mark at the end or the beginning of a sentence. It's common that we spell do, D-O, like, do they see you? And when I'm teaching ASL, I'm using my facial expressions, yes, but I have to explain to you something. It's natural. It's natural to use your eyebrows and when you're teaching that structure, it's a little bit different. So I have assessed what I do, and I never think when I am supposed to raise or furrow my eyebrows. It's ingrained. And so it happens while I'm communicating. And so when I teach, it's difficult for me to pay attention to when I'm raising and furrowing my eyebrows. So it's almost like, when I meet a person who doesn't know sign language, and in speaking, they typically will use facial expressions already ingrained in them. They're using facial expressions. So it's the same as how we use in ASL. So I'm noticing those eyebrow movements as natural and not something I need to teach within a structure. So then I use hand-based questions instead of facial expressions. So formal stage, for example, maybe a pageant interview question. So if they're asking a yes or no question, if they're just using facial expressions and saying something like, is the world a good place? World a good place with the eyebrows? As a pageant runner, I would be unsure if they were asking a question or not. It would be unclear to me. Instead, if they said, question, world is a good place, they would say, okay, I understand that they're asking a question. So that's why I wanted to focus more on hand-based questions, because I feel that they're more clear, and especially more in a formal-based setting. While if you're having a casual conversation, for example, you're saying, you okay? You don't have to preface with are or question and use your eyebrows. So I favor more of the hand-based questions as it pertains to clarity. And I see, does Gina have a question? And anyway, everyone's muted again. A couple months ago, there was a teacher organization, ASL teachers got together and had a discussion. And there was one person who's Asian and joined us in our discussion about ASL structure. And the individual said that in Asian countries, deaf Asians do not use hand-based questions. I don't know how, this concept was question mark, signed question mark, but not using the facial expression to indicate if it was a question, but using your hand-based question. Even though they're deaf, they still use their hands to indicate that there's a question. So they showed support to my way of asking yes or no questions, which was really interesting. Again, as working on stage or in an interview, I would rather than be very clear in the beginning, question mark, so that it's clear it's a question and not just raising eyebrows. The reason they taught ASL in the past of just using the facial expressions, they wanted to separate ASL from English. And I understand that, but when you remove question mark in the beginning, it does become confusing. So I want to throw out that you can sign question. Now going back to yes or no, well, with yes or no questions we've discussed, now we'll go back to the WH questions where I had skipped in the past.
Watch the video too. So now I will talk about WH question structures. So I have full screen on, I actually can't see the chat box. It covers it up. So, but I will pause and go back to look at the chat. Okay, so we've talked about yes, no questions, and now we'll talk about WH questions. So same thing at the beginning of a question, I usually put at the beginning as opposed to at the end, because I want to be able to tell that this is a question. But it doesn't mean that you can't put it at the end. You can. So for example, why do you want whatever it is? You already know that I'm starting with why, so you know that it's a question. Same thing with English. If you start with a WH question, we know that it's usually a question. So I feel like it functions the same way as in English. So you put it at the beginning of the sentence. So for example, how do you feel? So, you know, I understand that that's kind of a WH question at the beginning. What do you think about this? So, and I know already that you're asking a question. And the reason, why was it taught before to put it at the end? And I think, again, it was trying to make it look different than English. But, you know, sometimes they parallel and sometimes they don't. But it doesn't mean that ASL always follows English 100% of the time. No, it's got its own grammar and rules. So I think if you put it at the beginning, it's so much more beneficial because it's obvious you're asking a question. So that's my personal preference. So for yes, no, do you want to see a movie? Is this good? And so again, you're starting with the question. So to go back, and so where it parallels English, in English, you can also say, do you like me? And the question is inflected at the end of the sentence. But when you're teaching, it's not taught, the inflection is not taught. You're taught beginning structure with a WH question in written English, but then you realize you can put it at the beginning, at the end of a sentence. So in ASL, I teach it that it goes in the beginning, but you can switch it around the same way that you do in English. You're eating what? In English, you can say the same thing. So there's a parallel there between the two of them. So same thing as in English, I teach it at the beginning in ASL classes just because it's easier. And so there's note about the words can or should as a question. So I think that's good to use for like is, are, do kinds of yes and no questions. So can or should, again, you can start with question mark. Can I see? And that would apply the same way. Question mark, should I take something? So you can do that too. So as long as there are no questions, so that pause when you're asking a question, I kind of put into the native category. So like the eyebrow raise or the how, I think that's just kind of a natural thing. We do that with inflection in our voice too. So, but when I'm teaching, I don't teach specifically to pause. I kind of let that happen. And so I let people express themselves naturally, and I think that's fine. So I let it kind of naturally happen. People, I think, start to do that. But I think you're exactly right that they hold the eyebrow raise or they hold the question mark. And I think that's something that we do normally. I begin to teach that, I think, and then I think people start to notice, yeah, I usually teach, and then maybe I'll say, you know, there is an eyebrow raise to ask a question, but there's so many other teachers that are teaching. And so I don't want somebody to go to another class and think, well, why are they teaching different methods? So I usually just let people know that I teach with a question mark, but there also is an eyebrow raise. And so you know, if it's a yes, no question, I usually start with a question mark. But if you start with a WH, you don't have to have the question mark, you know, just start with the question. And so that's usually my grammar structure approach that I teach? Okay, that's great. Thank you. All right, any other questions? So now, when I was doing the introduction, I was talking about all the different things I was going to go through. We've gone through most of the list, but I do have some backups, some extra things that were not in the original list at the beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and cover some of those as well. So before I move on to some of the other grammar parts, I just want to throw out some idea about a letter-based sign. The idea of using less letter-based sign as opposed to family and signing it like this, or culture and changing it like this. There's some variety that's happening, or language and using this instead. So I thought this was kind of interesting. And as I started to look into it, I think there's some benefit to it and some less benefit. I have a friend who is a linguist who's doing research at USCD, who is talking about feelings growing up and how they learn to sign growing up, and an interpreter, for their education. And so they would sign family. And so with an F, and so some of the deaf friends would look and say, oh, I see that you're signing a little bit differently. And so I felt like that sometimes we overdo the cleanup and removal of the letter-based sign. So as an ASL teacher, it does have an impact and an influence on the community and how we sign. So I started to kind of look into it more to understand. I understand that we don't want such a strong English influence, but I think there's two different views. One is that abstraction if it doesn't have an iconic form to it, like math or geometry or calculus, that's kind of an abstraction. So how do you know how to describe it? Whereas if something that's very obvious, like king, you could sign it like this, or queen, you could change again. Oh, I'm going to change my camera. So prince or princess, you could sign the sign a little bit differently, or galaxy, you could sign like that. But I'm just kind of coming up with these things. But the idea is that there's so many things that you say, well, group or class or department, and that sign has so many different meanings, but if the letter actually has some benefit because it makes so much easier to understand which thing you're talking about. So I like letter signs, and I also like artistic signing. I like both of them. So I just want to, letter signs are not bad. I just want to put that out there. It's good for specific reasons. It can make things a lot easier. It can clarify, and it can allow the community, people in the community can make some adjustments. So for example, yesterday I was taking a workshop in international sign, and there was a lot of emphasis on not using lettered sign. And so I think there's signs that fit kind of a larger audience for that, people from other countries using different sign language. So I see some of the benefits of that, but I think it's important for you to know that letter signs are not bad necessarily. So for example, language, if you use this sign instead, that's fine. But you also have the word sentence or grammar. And so if you're using the same sign for each of those, how do you know how you're differentiating? So one is language, one is grammar, and based on the sentence. And again, context is so important. So if I'm talking about a sign language, of course, I know you mean the word language. So it's just important to be flexible with how you use it. Any questions about that, about lettered sign?
Okay, great. So now with the WH emphasis, when you have a sentence and then you emphasize with who, like the rhetorical question we were talking about earlier, I have noticed that this is sometimes overused. And so, you have your WH emphasis, WH emphasis. This is good for something like, for young kids when you're explaining something like doll, who? Dad. Doll, who? Mom. And that would be good. So, or making an announcement. So when you're making an announcement, say, and there's an event, when, and then you share the event date, or you know who this is, who, and then announce who. But in regular conversation, you don't really need to emphasize the WH. So sometimes I notice with ASL students it is overused. So I just want to caution that the WH is emphasis is great, but try not to overuse that. So now I'll move on to the next slide. So I'll run through clarification structure, which is understand important, are the examples. Cause structure, like happen, oops, or pow. Indeed structure, true biz, finish, OMG. So that structure, ASL has unique structure that's not really transferred into one word in English. There are so many different words you could choose that would be translated. So I want to touch on and run through these. So with 3D technology, how would you sign with your hand shape with technology? And then also using your body, 3D for the body. What time do I have? Oh, I have time. Okay. So for clarification structure, when I sign understand, the sign, yes, there is a sign for understand. However, when I'm signing it and then signing understand while I'm, while I'm signing a sentence, it could be translated to but, or however, or only. Understand just means I'm clarifying, or I'm trying to be clear here. And so important is another clarification with encouragement or obligation. So you would sign important, and the English translation would be as long as, or it is important. When I say IMPT, it's short for important. I'm just shortening it. I am trying to nudge students not to think of that IMPT as important, but using it like when I put undie, it's condensing understand. I don't want you to think it means understand. I want you to see it as undie, and that we would use it for but, however, and only. Important is, is like emphasis, okay? So here are some examples of sentences with understand or undie. So I will see you, but contact me first. So it's showing clarification here. I'm going to leave now, undie, leave the door open. So meaning, however, the door must be left open. It'll give you food, but you have to pay first. So it's just basic clarification when you're using the understand sign. Now, examples for important. It's important that you show up. If you show up, you'll be fine. When you meet at home, just bring your phone. It's important that you bring your phone. Text me, but it's important before midnight. So it means like you just have to do this. Like this part is important. So that's what I wanted to touch on. That's this is for important, any clarification or questions on clarification structure? So if you type in the chat, maybe go ahead and use your raise hand feature and indicate to me that you have typed something in the chat, and that's where I will look. Okay. Now moving on to happen or cause structure. First, you have hap, which what I mean is happen, but I'm condensing to hap for the same reason as the others. I didn't want you to confuse it with the English word. Pow means like something that happened, or I don't want people to think pow like a hit, but I want you to think of something that's shocking, a shocking cause. And then oops, meaning it's an unexpected cause. It doesn't, yes, you can sign that as wrong, but it doesn't actually mean wrong in this case. It just means like this was unexpected. So happen, I found your phone, which means like I just happened to, it was just a simple thing. Oh, let me move to this really quick. So in English, you could translate these this way. Happen could be translated as and then, or actually, suddenly, or coincidentally. And then for a shocking cause, for pow, suddenly, unexpectedly, out of the blue. And then for oops, for the sign for oops, by mistake, accidentally, or unintentionally. So in translating them, it's a little bit difficult, but there are some examples here. And then really could be the oops. Yeah. So now coming back to happen, I found your phone. I just happened to find it. And then pow, I got an ace. Didn't expect it, but pow, I got an ace. Person walked, oops, saw their mom. Meaning, not meaning like oops, a mistake, but it's just something that was unexpected. So I just say that it's a unique word function in ASL that could be used as a conjunction or an exclamation. Any questions thus far? So the indeed structure. First we have finish, then we have the oh my God, that's signed awful, and the true biz. So finish and OMG and true biz can be translated to literally, actually, indeed, and seriously. So it depends on which one, depending on the sentence. So finish, the sign finish, there are a few different meanings for it. You can just it can simply mean done, as in completed. Did, like, yeah, I did it. But the one I'm focusing on here means that like it's amazing. You know, it's not something that's just simple, but it's just exceptionally with completion. So awful, the OMG sign was awful. Then it becomes just a simple awful flick of the, just the simple flick instead of from the head. So it's like a wonder and shock. And then true biz, it really happens. It really happens. So here's a list, and just a second, we'll switch.
So here's a list of examples. So true biz, they forgot. Like it just happened that they forgot. And like, ooh, oh my God, I feel sick. Like, oh, wow, I wonder how that happened. And like, oh, finished, I can't text, which means, oh my goodness, something happened. It's something that's bad. So finish can mean something good as well. So before I go and finish with these, some of these unique functional structures. Any questions about that before I switch to 3D hand shapes? So the rest of this will be talking, the rest of the lecture will be talking about hand shapes. So 3D technology, this is kind of a new addition to my teaching. So this list are different hand shapes that represent like an L for a screen, like this, like a close and open your screen to expand or contract, to click on something to expand and contract. Text notification can be, a 1 or a 2. Something came up, something showed up on my alerts. Scroll is I'm typing something, I'm scrolling through with the 4 hands. Again, batteries can be charged or not, camera or video, and you can do that directionally. And so this is, again, which way that it's a 3D verb, which way the camera is pointing. Same thing with pictures. Picture can be directional. Light can be like this, and click, like, a like with the thumbs up. So you're showing it with a thumbs up. That's kind of a new sign, and I like that. That's great. So, and again, with the mouth movements, again, some of the basic verb descriptions that you would use as adverbs. So, the low quality or slow might be the tongue out. So if I click on it and it takes a long time for that to open, I might use the tongue out. Or if it seems like it's working really hard, or the ooh just goes really fast, or it's harder to get that open. So again, it's a 3D plus the mouth movements working together. And so there's a lot, if I, were to translate that into an English sentence, there'd be a lot of words. But as you show it in sign, all the information is there and it's very visual. So, and now talking about 3D plurals. So there's 2 ways of explaining plurals. You can do frequency, or you can do the slide. So if I'm going to go to all the places, I might show it like this, which is in the slide, which means everything's included. If I'm going to many places, I can do frequent jumps or frequent stops. So I can do, they're a little bit different. You can see the difference between them. But generally, multiples in 3D, so you can have a car, several cars, which means there's multiple cars, or you can just have a slide, which means there's just a line of cars that you're explaining the way that they look. All over can be like this, and many can be like this. A group can be translated to this. Group movement can be like this. A line or a list. So again, the E face is a lot, or just kind of a casual amount. So you can add an adverb. If you do this, that just kind of a regular amount of people. But if it's the E face, it's wow, there's a lot of people there, or not very many. So even though you're signing like this, but you're using the ooh face, so it means like there's not as many as usual. And so like this face where you're showing, it's like, oh my goodness, it's just wave after wave of people. And so you can see the difference in how you explain those. Any questions about this? And now we're talking about 3D body entities. So again, like the one figure for a person, you can also have this. So this is good for like jumping, laying down, different ways that you would show represent a person. So I tend to use this, but if I'm specifically talking about somebody jumping or something that you would use to show the legs moving, like parkour, like jumping off a wall and doing a flip. So laying down. So again, if you want to specifically focus on the legs, you might want to do them independently. Feet, again, you can show with a B hand or like a shoe. So something that's foot based. Head would be the S hand. Maybe the head is ducking under something or walking along or bumping heads. So again, mouth movements can show some of the different adverbs, adjectives. So a lot of them become pretty similar, depending on, and the same concept applies to lots of different hand shapes. So walking like this might be like, oh, it's really hard to walk through. Maybe you're walking through something really heavy. Or this is just kind of like casual walking. I think of this as kind of the basic level. This is just kind of like an everyday thing. This is just, it's common to see people use this. But this kind of ooh is like maybe they're walking very easily, or they're working really hard, or it's taking a long time, or they're kind of lazy, or they're slow, they're clumsy. So, and if you do this, pow, you know, maybe they ran into something or they fell. So I was just talking on some of these things, just a second. Oh, this is strange. Can't see the chat. Mm-hmm. So I see the comment in the chat about some of the different lettered signs. Days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So that's a good example of when it's right to use a lettered sign, because otherwise you wouldn't know. Client or person, right. So that's a good point. So a person and a client, they're different things. So you have to be able to establish human, again, specifically if you're talking about using that word human, so that's good. Dates, yeah, like the day of the month, or birthday. There's signs for birthday. Oh, yeah, there's a variety of signs for that. Somebody had asked, is there any rule about lettered signs as to when they're appropriate? Like I said, if I'm not sure that there's any specific rules, I'll think about it. Nothing's come to mind. I guess really, I think if you're talking about a basic 3D sign, but if you want to expand and explain a little bit more, to be able to recognize maybe the way they're postured or the way they're sitting or the way their head's moving. But again, in relation to role shifting and shoulder shifting, I think if there's a dialogue between two different people, then you know the difference between who's speaking. But if there's no dialogue, then there's not much need for the body shift. If you want to show a reaction, where you know how somebody is reacting, you can show the shoulder shift. But it's interesting because ASL teachers respond or call that a role shift, and it's usually for dialogue. But deaf people, when they're doing that, I think that's more of a head shift as opposed to a shoulder shift. And I'm like, oh yeah, really, really? And then, well, why did you say that? And so I don't move my whole body. It's usually my head that moves back and forth. So it's more of a head shift maybe as opposed to a body shift. So, but again, how do you know when to use that? I think you use that something more like if there's dialogue, but if not, then you would just kind of show the basic movements of the people. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, so you can drop your hand, the hand raise. Okay, great. So the last part of this is more of the 3D run through. So just a second. So I'm going to go through these last couple of things here on the list. So 3D lights, elements, objects, appearances, geography, transportation. So for lights, it's usually the 5-hand, but there's some differences as far as movement. So like this is a flashing, like taking a picture. You can have a camera that moves around, a spotlight, or the light flickering in and out, or lights flaring, or all the lights going off. If you do this E mouth movement, it can be different intensities for the light or the movement of the light. "3D geography." So again, tree, 5-hand. I think there's really a 5 and an L, 5-hand and an L hand. So space, water. I want to expand a little bit about the sign for river or ocean or lake. So when I teach at the beginning, level 1 ASL, I usually tend to do it very slowly. I spell very slowly. And so there's a good example. So like ocean, and some people don't like that to use that lettered, but I like that because if you don't say that, it can just be water because it's like water is a lettered sign too. So why is it okay to use that, but not the O for ocean? Interpreter switch.
So river is another example using the letter. It's a very clear sign, but people don't like that sign with the R. I don't think it's a big deal showing the river with your R. But I live here in San Diego, and most of the time I've been socializing with other ASL teachers, and there are different perspectives. So I try to compromise, but my personal preference, I like ocean and river as O and R. And if you want to spell ocean and river, that's fine. I give you that choice. But anyway, yes, water, body of water. When you show an area with water, lake, and then show the lake size. Island, you can show the size and texture of the land. You can show the intensity and whether it's moving with your tongue out, it's really kind of rough or casual with your different mouth morphemes. Another good example, yes, restaurant and cafeteria and eating, so different letter signs. Thank you for answering that. Someone asked, Jonathan asked about the different letter signs, and there were some good suggestions in the chat in response to that. Okay, so next. So I think I'm going to leave this as not in the full presentation mode, just so I can see this clearly, but the 3D objects, this is good. So in showing the size, you're showing you can show with your hand shapes, and I want to show size, like when it's big, big. Students sometimes assume that we have to use big like this, like a big bug, but no, bugs are, can be big with this hand shape. And this doesn't have to be small. This hand shape can actually be big, depending on what the actual predicted size of an object is. So you can use big, but you can use small, and that's how I used to teach. But that's not true, because a big bug, you would still use this hand shape. So it would really depend. And so now I teach that if it's really thin, it can be like this, and if it's really thick, you can use the B hand shape. If it's a box, you can use this mouth morpheme and hand shape. The toothbrush, you don't want to say you have a big toothbrush with the B hand shape. You want to use your one hand shape. So it depends on when you're talking about size. Empty, yes, the 25 hand shape. And then I'm looking at the chat, working on reading the word big. And children are having a hard time understanding the concept of big. So expose them. So like, okay, there's a BIG house, BIG car, and a BIG person, BIG bug. Okay, so then you show that the house, big, would be like signed like this. A big person would be signed like this. And then for a big bug would be signed like this. So you expose them, to different meanings of the same word, and they may be able to understand the concept better. It may help them to understand better. And using the 3D hand shape, that's really important. So 3D objects, yes, you can use those different mouth morphemes. Toilet paper, oh, it was really thick toilet paper. If it was really thin toilet paper, you would use this mouth morpheme. So you see the difference in my mouth movement to show the different meanings. All right, good. Now, 3D elements. So the sign for elements is unknown, but I use, kind of like a snow combination to rain as elements. But you can use your hand shape, your 5 hand shape, for wind, fire, solid, magic. And so fire, like this. And I notice when I'm teaching, I ask students, would you mind applying the 3D elements in this? So I want to test their grammar use of the 3D elements. It's very hard to measure. Sometimes the students say, okay, rain. And it's difficult because I want them to add an exaggeration, like intensity of the rain, or as if it's trickling, or it's intense storming. So I have to clarify with my instruction. So perhaps I should say 3D elements with facial expression. And that may help them to start to show me those variations of how intense the rain is. And so this slide, I think, will help as a formula for this that could be used. That's good. All right, so appearances. And this would be similar to 3D objects, but it's more organic based, where you're showing the hair shape and you're showing the different features, small and large, the long nose, the large nose. So that would be similar, showing the ear shape and size, showing the hair shape and size. And so you have a lot of the similar mouth morphemes and movements as the others. 3D with transportation, In general, for a vehicle, you typically use the 3 hand shape. Personally, I don't understand why it's the 3 hand shape. Why don't we use this hand shape with the B? But I was told that long ago, the French, before cars, this was created. And in a ship, the ship would have the sail, and there were typically like 3 different parts or something. And so then that was how that sign began and was created. And so it's been applied to vehicles of all sorts. However, visually, the 3 doesn't make sense. It should be the B hand shape or closed 5 hand shape. However, it's already been ingrained in our language, but vehicle could be a bike, and you can use this. You can use this hand shape for trailer. Airplane is a different hand shape, or boat. And so I usually show that when you ride a boat, you don't actually sign ride. It's all ingrained into one 3D sign. So I ride on a boat. Instead of doing that, you can just show how the boat was going. Instead of riding on a bike, you're showing the bike, you're depicting that. So then you have the plane and riding on a plane. Facial expressions. When you're on the plane, you're showing the intensity of the ride. You're showing how sloppy or how fast or how long. And so it just shows the different adjectives applied to the flying of the plane. Now I have discussed everything I plan to, so I want to open it up